At the Celestial Nexus, the biggest and most extravagant casino in the galaxy, excitement buzzed in the air like electricity. Every corner was filled with alien species from every corner of the universe, all gathered for a high-stakes card game like no other. The casino's opulence was unmatched: shimmering lights, grand arches, and halls that seemed to stretch beyond the stars themselves. The gamblers were of every shape and size, some humanoid, others creatures of unimaginable form, all with one goal: to win. At the center of this galaxy-wide spectacle sat Captain Eric Thorne, a human whose reputation for cleverness and a sharp eye at the card table had earned him respect across the stars. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest of men, but he had something more valuable: an uncanny ability to read people and situations, which had gotten him out of many tight spots in the past. His dark, short hair and rugged features made him seem like someone you could trust, but those who knew him understood that under that calm exterior was a man who was always calculating his next move. Across the table from Eric sat Galderok, an ancient alien warlord whose name was spoken with both fear and awe. His skin was a deep, shimmering green, his eyes glowing with the wisdom and cruelty of someone who had lived for centuries. His sharp, angular features seemed almost carved from stone, and his intimidating presence was enough to make anyone think twice before challenging him. Galderok had lost much over the years: his family, his empire, and now, it seemed, his last chance to regain it all. The game they were playing wasn't just for money or material wealth. This game had something much deeper on the line, something personal. Galderok, with his usual smug confidence, pushed forward a pile of cards, his voice smooth as he spoke. "I wager my daughter." The room fell silent. People stopped in their tracks, staring at the alien warlord in disbelief. For someone as powerful as Galderok to bet his own flesh and blood was unheard of, yet here he was, offering up his daughter like some form of currency. Eric raised an eyebrow, his heart racing. He had seen a lot of things in his time, but this was something else entirely. "Your daughter?" he asked, his voice steady, hiding the shock he felt inside. Galderok nodded, his cold gaze never leaving Eric's. "Yes, Lysandra. If you win, she is yours. If you lose, the consequences will be far worse than you can imagine." Eric couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary wager. Galderok's daughter was known throughout the galaxy for her beauty and grace, but there were whispers that she was far more than just a prize to be won. Her eyes, silver and glowing with an inner light, were said to carry the weight of a deep and ancient power. Eric had heard stories, but he had never expected to be in a position to find out if they were true. As he sat there, considering his next move, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of man would gamble away his own flesh and blood. Lysandra had no choice but to watch from the sidelines as her fate hung in the balance. She was a tall, striking woman with flowing silver hair that cascaded down her back like a waterfall of light. Her eyes, deep and enigmatic, locked onto Eric's with an intensity that almost felt as if she could peer straight into his soul. There was something in her gaze that suggested she knew more than she let on, but she remained silent, her expression unreadable. Eric, feeling the weight of the situation, finally made up his mind. The stakes were higher than anything he had ever faced, but his gut told him that he couldn't back down. If he did, not only would he lose, but someone else, someone innocent, would pay the price. Without another word, Eric accepted the challenge. The game began in earnest, and with every card drawn, the tension in the room thickened. Every move was critical. Eric knew he couldn't afford to make a mistake. As the game unfolded, he began to realize that this was more than just a game of chance. It was a test of skill, intuition, and perhaps fate itself. And when the final card was placed on the table, Eric Thorne didn't just win the game. He had won a person's freedom, and an entire galaxy's future was about to change forever. After the game ended, Eric Thorne stood at the table, his hand still on the deck of cards, his mind racing. He had won the gamble, But the reality of the situation had only just begun to set in. The prize he had claimed was not a pile of wealth or a grand treasure. It was Lysandra, the daughter of Galdarok, a powerful and ruthless warlord. As the other players slowly scattered, murmurs filled the air, but none dared approach Eric or the woman who now stood beside him. Lysandra's presence was almost ethereal. Her tall frame radiated a quiet strength, and her silver hair shimmered under the lights like it was made of stardust. Her eyes, glowing a deep and unnatural silver, seemed to reflect the entire galaxy, as though they had witnessed things no one else could ever imagine. She was beautiful, but there was a sadness in her gaze, a depth that hinted at years of pain and fear. As she stood there, her silence was deafening. Eric couldn't help but wonder what kind of life she had led under her father's rule. Was she a prisoner to his ambitions, or was there more to her story? The tension between them was palpable, and yet neither spoke a word. Eric couldn't shake the feeling that Lysandra wasn't just a pawn in her father's game. There was something more to her, something hidden beneath the surface. Her strange powers, her silence, the way she looked at him as if she already knew him. There was a mystery wrapped around her that Eric couldn't ignore. But for now, he knew one thing for sure. She was his responsibility. Galdarok had placed her in his hands, and Eric had no intention of failing her. As they made their way toward the docking bay where the Tempest, Eric's trusted ship, was waiting, Lysandra spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, but laced with an undeniable strength. "You don't understand what you've done," she said, her words carrying a weight that made Eric stop in his tracks. He turned to face her, but she didn't meet his eyes. "You think you've won something, but my father is not a man who lets go of what's his." Eric felt a pang of unease. He had expected resistance, but her words had an edge to them, as though she wasn't just warning him. She was trying to protect him from something. But what? "I don't want to be part of his schemes," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never asked for this. My father, he gambled away my future, my freedom. I've been his prisoner for years." It was then that Eric began to understand. Lysandra wasn't just a prize to be won or a piece of property to be owned. She was a person, someone who had been forced into a life she never wanted. Eric couldn't imagine the kind of pressure she must have lived under, constantly under her father's thumb. But now, she was free, at least for the moment. He couldn't help but feel protective of her. No one deserved to live a life like that, not even someone like her. As they reached the ship, the crew of the Tempest was already preparing for takeoff. Eric had a ragtag group of loyal misfits, each one with a past they were running from, and each one, in some way, understanding the weight of freedom. There was Callan Vox, the quiet, calculating second-in-command with sharp features and piercing eyes. Juno, the tough-talking mechanic with an uncanny ability to fix anything. And Vera, the skilled navigator who had a knack for getting out of tricky situations. They all looked up as Eric and Lysandra approached, but none of them asked questions. They could see the tension in Eric's posture, the uncertainty in Lysandra's gaze. The crew had learned long ago to trust their captain's judgment. Lysandra stepped onto the ship hesitantly, her eyes scanning the interior with a mixture of awe and suspicion. She had never been in a human vessel before, and everything about the Tempest was new to her. The strange hum of the engines, the flashing lights, and the sound of the crew bustling about, it all felt foreign. But as she passed Eric and entered the cockpit, she hesitated. Her voice, quieter this time, reached him. "I don't know where to go now. My entire life has been a lie." Eric looked at her, understanding the weight of her words. "We'll figure it out," he said, though even he wasn't sure how. As the ship's engines roared to life, he knew this was just the beginning. He had no idea what kind of trouble they were about to find, but one thing was certain. The path ahead would be dangerous, and no matter how strong she seemed, Lysandra would need help, and Eric was determined to provide it. As the Tempest soared into the depths of space, the hum of the engines was a constant reminder that they were no longer on the ground, no longer safe in the heart of the celestial nexus. Eric sat in the captain's chair, his hands gripping the controls, his mind swirling with everything that had happened. He had no idea what kind of trouble he had just stepped into. All he knew was that he couldn't go back. Lysandra, still an enigma in many ways, was now his responsibility. But that responsibility was beginning to feel like a weight he wasn't sure he was strong enough to bear. Lysandra had kept to herself, sitting quietly in the corner of the ship's common area, her eyes lost in the swirling stars outside the windows. She wasn't speaking much, but Eric could tell that her mind was racing just as much as his. Her past with her father, Galderock, seemed to haunt her. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she flinched whenever someone mentioned his name. But it wasn't just her father's shadow that loomed over her. There was something else. Eric had seen the way she reacted when the relic had been found, like she knew more about it than she was letting on. Her powers, too, were becoming harder to ignore. She had barely controlled them during the attack at the Celestial Nexus, and Eric wasn't sure what to think. Was she dangerous? Or was it just the fear of her own strength that held her back? The ship's crew moved around the ship, doing their duties as usual. Callan Vox, Eric's second-in-command, was stationed in the navigation bay, his sharp eyes scanning the stars for any signs of danger. He didn't ask questions, but Eric could see the suspicion in his gaze whenever he glanced at Lysandra. Callan had always been a bit of a mystery himself, a man with a past that he didn't talk about. And Eric had learned long ago that if Callan didn't trust someone, it was wise to keep an eye on them. Then there was Juno, the mechanic. She was loud, tough, and always seemed to know how to fix anything that went wrong on the ship. She had a knack for keeping things running smoothly, but she wasn't one to shy away from speaking her mind. When she entered the common area, she looked at Lysandra curiously, but didn't say anything. Instead, she dropped into the seat across from Eric with a sigh. "So, what's the deal with her?" Juno asked, her eyes flicking to Lysandra, who had yet to meet anyone's gaze directly. "She just showed up with us, and now you're acting like she's your responsibility." "I get it, Eric, but she's got a look in her eyes like she's hiding something." Eric leaned back in his chair, considering her words. He had thought the same thing. Lysandra was definitely hiding something, and he wasn't sure how long it would be before it came crashing down on them. But that was the problem. He didn't know what it was. All he knew was that Galderock wasn't a man who lost without consequences, and if Eric had any hopes of protecting Lysandra, he needed to understand what she was truly capable of. "I don't know yet," Eric said, his voice low. "But I'm not going to just abandon her. We need to figure out who she is, what her father's after, and what those powers of hers mean." Juno raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Instead, she stood up, clapping Eric on the shoulder before heading back to the engine room. The ship was still a few hours away from the next station, a neutral port where they hoped to lay low for a while. But even as Eric glanced back at Lysandra, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. And he was right. Just as they approached the outskirts of the station, the ship's sensors began to beep wildly, signaling an incoming ship, one that was rapidly closing in on their position. Eric's heart raced as he immediately pulled the ship into evasive maneuvers, but it was clear that the other ship was faster, more advanced. Within moments, the Tempest was surrounded by the hulking form of a massive warship, the emblem of Galderock's forces emblazoned on its hull. "Brace for impact," Eric shouted, his voice sharp, as the crew scrambled into position. Lysandra stood up, her face pale, and for the first time, she looked directly at Eric. "They're here for me," she said softly, her voice betraying no fear, but Eric could see the conflict in her eyes. "You shouldn't have come after me." But it was too late. The warship fired a warning shot, and the Tempest rocked violently as Eric fought to maintain control. The battle for Lysandra's freedom had just begun, and Eric realized that this wasn't just about saving her. It was about fighting a war that they were already losing. The warship loomed ahead, its massive form casting a shadow over the Tempest as it spun and twirled to evade the incoming blasts. Eric's hands moved swiftly over the controls, his every instinct focused on keeping his crew safe. The ship groaned under the pressure, but he wasn't about to let it fall to Galdarok's forces, not without a fight. The crew scrambled, each member springing into action. Callan Vox, ever the sharp-eyed strategist, was already in the cockpit with Eric, scanning the tactical screens. "They've got us outgunned," Callan muttered, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We can't outrun them. We need to think fast." Eric's mind raced. They couldn't escape by speed, and they certainly couldn't fight back head-on. The Tempest was no slouch in a skirmish. But this wasn't just any ship. This was one of Galdarok's warships, and it carried enough firepower to obliterate them with a single hit. Eric's thoughts raced, weighing the options, and then a plan began to form. One that was risky, but could buy them enough time to get out of this alive. "Juno," Eric called out over the comms, "I need you to get to the engine room. Now. I'm going to need a full power surge in a minute. Can you handle it?" The mechanic's voice came through, laced with determination. "You bet I can, Captain. Just tell me what to do." Eric's fingers flew across the controls as he spoke to his crew, his voice calm but urgent. "Callan, I need you to disable their weapon systems. Juno's going to overload the engines, and we need to make a quick jump once we've got enough power. It's risky, but it's our only shot." Callan nodded, already moving to carry out the order. As Eric worked, his eyes flicked to Lysandra, who had remained oddly quiet through the entire ordeal. She stood at the edge of the cockpit, her hands clenched, her eyes wide but strangely composed. She hadn't once shown fear, and Eric couldn't help but wonder if it was because she had seen this before. The warship's laser cannons fired again, but Eric's quick maneuvers just barely kept them from getting hit. Lysandra finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "They won't let you go so easily," she said, her silver eyes locked onto Eric's. "My father's ships are more than just war machines. They're linked to his power. If you don't disable the control systems from the inside, they won't stop hunting you." Eric's heart sank. He knew that Lysandra was right. The warship wasn't just a ship. It was a tool for Galdarok's larger, far-reaching influence. Her father's connection to his forces ran deeper than Eric had realized, and now it seemed they were truly trapped. But there was no time to dwell on that. He needed to act now, or they were all going to end up in Galdarok's hands. "Callan," Eric said, his voice firm, "I need you to hack into their systems. Now, find a way to disrupt their control long enough for us to make the jump." "Working on it," Callan responded quickly, fingers dancing over his console. "Give me a second." Meanwhile, in the engine room, Juno was working at full speed. The engine room was bathed in a soft red glow, with every console lit up as she adjusted the settings, preparing the ship for an overload of power. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked to stabilize the output, her hands moving faster than the eye could follow. "All right, Captain," she muttered to herself, "this better work." As the seconds ticked down, the tension in the cockpit grew. Eric's mind was focused, but his thoughts kept drifting to Lysandra. What had her life been like under Galdarok's thumb? She was strong, capable, yet there was so much about her that Eric still didn't understand. What powers did she have? Was there more to her than she had let on? The silence between them was broken as the warship fired another round of shots, this time hitting the side of the Tempest. The ship rattled violently, and the alarm blared through the corridors. Eric gritted his teeth, keeping the ship steady despite the damage. "Juno now," he shouted. The ship's engines roared to life with an intensity that vibrated through the entire vessel. Power surge initiated. Juno's voice came through the comms, filled with triumph. "We've got enough juice to make the jump." "Callan, now," Eric barked. Callan's fingers flew over his console, and the warship's control systems flickered, as though a brief window had opened. "Done. You've got your window, Captain," he called out. Eric didn't hesitate. With a deep breath, he slammed his hands onto the controls, sending the Tempest into a high-speed warp. The stars outside the window stretched and blurred as the ship hurtled away from Galderok's forces. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. They had made it. The warship that had been so close to ending them now seemed like a distant memory, fading into the vastness of space. The stars blurred past the Tempest as it traveled deeper into the unknown reaches of space. The ship was running on the bare minimum power, and the crew, though relieved, couldn't afford to relax just yet. Eric Thorne, still gripping the captain's chair, let out a long sigh. They had narrowly escaped Galderok's warship, but he knew better than anyone that the danger was far from over. Even now, the massive warlord's forces were no doubt regrouping, preparing for another assault. He glanced at his crew, each one exhausted but determined. Callan Vox was the first to speak, his voice calm, almost detached as he ran a hand through his dark, cropped hair. "We're safe, for now, but it won't be long before they trace our route." His sharp eyes never left the screen in front of him as he monitored their position. "The warship will have reported our escape, and I wouldn't be surprised if they've already sent a tracker after us." Eric nodded grimly. He knew that Callan was right. They had bought themselves a little time, but no one knew Galderok better than Lysandra. She had grown up under the warlord's rule, and if anyone had an idea of how far his reach extended, it was her. Lysandra, who had been silent ever since the escape, finally spoke. "He's going to keep hunting us, no matter how far we go." Her voice was quiet, but there was a hardness to it that made Eric pause. She had been distant since the battle, her silver eyes clouded with a storm of thoughts. It was as if the close call had pushed her to a breaking point. "Galderok won't stop until he has me back, and I'm the key to maintaining it." Eric stood up from his chair, walking over to where she sat. "You're not going back to him. We're not letting him control you anymore, Lysandra." She looked at him, her gaze unreadable. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, her hands tightly gripping the armrests of her seat. Then, finally, she sighed. "You don't understand. You think it's just about me. Galderok, he's not just a warlord. He's built something far darker than I could ever explain. It's not just his ships or his forces. He's tied to something much bigger, something ancient. My father is a part of a group that has been manipulating the galaxy for centuries." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Eric had always suspected that Lysandra's past was more complicated than she had let on. But this was something else entirely, a part of a secret group, ancient powers. It was as though a door had been opened into a much darker world, one that Eric wasn't sure he was ready to enter. "You need to explain," Eric said, his voice soft but insistent. "We can't keep running and hoping that we'll outrun them. You're the only one who can help us understand what we're up against." Lysandra stood up, her movements fluid but tense. She hesitated, as though debating whether she should reveal more of her story. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and full of regret. "I didn't have a choice. I was born into it. My father's group. They call themselves the Veil, a secret faction of ancient beings who control the flow of power in the galaxy. Galderok is their enforcer. He's the one who makes sure the galaxy's rulers stay in line. And me. I'm part of their plan." Eric felt a chill run down his spine. The Veil. He had never heard of such a group. But the way Lysandra spoke of them, it was clear they were not to be taken lightly. This wasn't just about running from her father anymore. It was about something much larger, something that could affect the entire galaxy. "So you're saying," Callan spoke up from the navigation station, his voice sharp with disbelief, "that we're up against a secret group of ancient beings who control everything, and your father's their enforcer, and we're just supposed to what? Fight them off?" Lysandra's eyes flashed with a mix of anger and sorrow. "You don't understand. I never wanted any part of it. But I'm connected to them. My powers, they come from the Veil. They were trying to use me as a weapon, a way to control all of them. But when I saw what they were really doing, I ran. I knew I had to get away. Eric took a step closer to her, his voice steady but filled with concern. We'll figure it out together. We're not letting them get to you, Lysandra. Not again. Lysandra met his gaze, and for a brief moment, the walls she had built around herself seemed to crack. There was a flicker of hope in her eyes, a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel for years. Thank you, she whispered, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. But just as the tension in the room began to ease, a warning signal blared throughout the ship. Eric's heart sank. What now? He muttered, rushing to the control panel. On the screen, an ominous sight appeared. Another warship, similar in size to the one they had escaped, was rapidly approaching. This time, they were not alone. A fleet was on the move, and Galderok's forces had already found them. The tension on the Tempest was palpable as the warship drew closer, its shadow stretching across the stars like an inescapable nightmare. Eric's heart raced, his mind focused solely on the controls. He had expected Galderok's forces to catch up eventually, but not this quickly. The fleet was vast, its ships surrounding the Tempest in a tight formation, blocking any chance of escape. He glanced at the crew, each member bracing for what was coming. Callan Vox was already at the tactical station, fingers moving rapidly over the controls as he calculated their options. Juno, in the engine room, had her hands full, making sure that the already strained engines wouldn't fail them now. Captain, we can't outrun them this time, Callan called out, his voice grim. There are too many ships, and they've got the advantage in firepower. We're sitting ducks. Eric cursed under his breath. He had known they couldn't keep running forever, but the overwhelming odds were beginning to sink in. Then we fight. We've got no other choice. Lysandra, who had been silent for most of the past few minutes, stood up. She moved toward Eric, her eyes hardening as she looked out the viewports at the looming fleet. You don't understand, she said, her voice low but fierce. This isn't just about fighting them. It's about surviving long enough to make it to the Vale's stronghold. We can't win this battle. At least, not with what we have. Eric turned to face her, frustration mixing with his determination. Then what do you suggest? Sit back and let them capture us. Lysandra hesitated, but her voice remained steady. No, but if we're going to survive, we need to go on the offensive. There's a hidden weakness in their fleet, a small blind spot in their formation, something they don't expect us to exploit. I can help us take advantage of it. Callan's eyes flicked to Lysandra, creeping into his gaze. You've been holding back. What aren't you telling us? Lysandra didn't flinch. My powers, they come from the Vale. But I'm not fully in their control. I can use them to disrupt their systems, weaken their coordination. But I'll need your help to get close enough. Eric studied her for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't fully trust Lysandra, not yet. But in this moment, she might be their only chance. All right, tell us what we need to do. Lysandra nodded, a brief flash of gratitude crossing her face, before her expression hardened once more. We'll need to disable their main communications first. If we can cut off their ability to coordinate, they'll be vulnerable. But we'll have to get in close enough to board one of their ships. The Vale's forces will never expect us to be that bold. Eric turned to Callan, who was already pulling up the data on his console. Do you think it's possible? Callan's lips pressed into a thin line as he analyzed the fleet's movements. It's a long shot. But we don't have a choice. If we don't try, we'll be sitting ducks in the middle of their crosshairs. Then we prepare for a fight, Eric said, his voice steely. We get close enough to one of their ships, and we make our move. The crew sprang into action, each person moving with purpose. Callan adjusted the ship's course, setting it on a collision path with the weakest point in the enemy formation. Juno worked quickly in the engine room, pushing the ship's systems to their limits to give them the speed they needed to close the gap. Eric sat in the captain's chair, his hand steady on the controls, his eyes scanning the monitors for any signs of incoming fire. It was a high-risk maneuver, but it was the only one they had. As they neared the enemy ships, the tension grew thick in the air. The fleet had formed a tight web around them, its guns trained on the Tempest. The first wave of fire came fast, but Eric was ready, executing evasive maneuvers with precision. The ship jerked violently as the blasts hit the shields, but the Tempest held strong. Lysandra stood near the door to the shuttle bay, her eyes closed as she focused. Her silver eyes flickered with power, and the air around her seemed to hum. Eric could feel the energy building, and though he wasn't sure of the full extent of her abilities, he knew she wasn't bluffing. If she could really disrupt the enemy's communications, it could be the opening they needed. "Eric," Callan said, his voice tight with urgency. "We're getting close. I'll need your signal to make the final push." Eric's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. They were committed. "Lysandra, you ready?" She opened her eyes, and for the first time since they'd met, Eric saw a flicker of hope in them. "Ready." With one final command, Eric launched the Tempest forward, closing the gap between them and the enemy fleet. The ship shot through the lines of enemy ships with incredible speed, narrowly dodging the barrage of fire from their weapons. As they reached the heart of the enemy formation, Lysandra's powers flared. The ship's hull vibrated with the force of the Tempest's aggressive maneuvering. Eric's grip tightened on the controls as he steered them deeper into the heart of the enemy fleet. The ship shook from a near miss, but they were too close now to back out. Lysandra's powers were still disrupting the enemy communications, but it wouldn't last long. They had mere minutes before Galderok's forces regained control. "Get ready," Eric barked to his crew, his eyes scanning the view ahead. He could see the target, a large enemy cruiser, its defenses weakened by the communication blackout. If they could board that ship, they might find what they needed to finally take down Galderok. Callan's fingers danced over his console. "I'm locking onto their shuttle bay coordinates now. We've got one shot at this. Make it count, Captain." Lysandra stood near the hatch, her eyes closed in concentration. The force of her abilities was still rippling through the air around them. Eric wasn't sure what she could do exactly, but he trusted her to pull them through. Her powers had already bought them precious seconds, but now it was all about making those seconds count. Juno's voice crackled through the comms. "Engines are holding steady, Captain. But I can't promise much longer if we keep this pace up. You need to board fast and get out of there before we overheat." "Understood," Eric responded, pushing the Tempest forward with even more urgency. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip through their fingers. The enemy ships were starting to regain their communication, and it was only a matter of time before they started coordinating an attack again. Eric had to act now. "Prepare to board," he called out to his crew, heart hammering in his chest. They were so close. 3 seconds, Callan said, his voice steady, though Eric could hear the tension in it. "Prepare for launch." The cruiser's shuttle bay loomed ahead like an open mouth, ready to swallow them whole. The moment they entered its vicinity, Eric could feel the weight of the decision hanging over him. If this failed, they'd be sitting ducks, trapped in enemy territory. But if it worked, they could dismantle Galderok's forces from the inside. "Now," Eric shouted. He pushed the lever forward, sending the Tempest hurtling toward the shuttle bay. Their ship's shields flickered under enemy fire, but Eric kept his focus, knowing they only had one shot at this. With a gut-wrenching thud, the Tempest docked with the cruiser, and the crew barely had time to react before the boarding ramp slammed into place. Lysandra was the first to move. Without a word, she activated the door and stepped out into the dark, metallic halls of the enemy vessel. Eric followed close behind, gun drawn, ready for anything. The rest of the crew quickly joined them, each one geared up for the fight ahead. The corridors inside the cruiser were eerily quiet. The usual hum of activity had died down with the loss of communication, but Eric could tell they weren't alone. He signaled for the crew to move silently as they navigated the maze-like halls. They were looking for the central control room, a place where they could disrupt the ship's systems even further and gain access to its main weapon systems. "We need to split up," Callan whispered. "Lysandra, you and me can hack into the control systems. Juno, stay with Eric. You'll need backup if things go wrong." Eric nodded and led the way, making sure to keep his eyes open for any signs of enemy soldiers. He didn't expect them to be caught off guard for long. The ship's security systems would likely have already noticed their presence, and reinforcements would be on the way. The sound of footsteps echoed from the end of the hall. Eric's instincts kicked in, and he quickly pressed himself against the wall, pulling the others with him. The enemy soldiers passed by, their armor clanking as they moved, unaware of the small group hiding just out of sight. Eric waited for a beat, then motioned for the crew to continue moving forward. They reached the control room door, and Callan wasted no time. "We're in," he muttered as the door slid open. Inside, the room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the control panels. The faint hum of power systems was the only sound as Callan immediately began working his way through the ship's systems, bypassing firewalls and locking down the doors. Eric stood guard, his senses alert as he kept an eye on the door. He knew that this was the moment of truth. If they could secure control of the cruiser's systems, they could turn the tide of the battle. But if they failed, the door to the control room slammed open, and Eric's heart skipped a beat. Enemy soldiers stormed in, guns raised. Without thinking, Eric drew his blaster and fired. The soldiers dropped, one by one, as the crew fought back with deadly precision. Eric's fingers flew over the control panel, his mind racing as he adjusted the cruiser's systems. They had seized control, but time was slipping away, and Galderach's forces would soon regroup. They couldn't afford to sit idly. Callan's sharp eyes darted between the various redouts, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "We've got full control over the ship's weapon systems, but it won't be long before they figure out what we're doing. We need to make our move fast," Callan said, his voice steady but urgent. He wasn't looking at Eric now. His focus was entirely on the ship's defenses, anticipating the counterattack that was sure to come. Lysandra stood nearby, her silver eyes flickering with a strange intensity as she scanned the monitors. "We can't just fight our way out. Galderach's forces are too numerous. But if we disrupt their fleet's command structure, we'll have a chance." Eric nodded. He knew Lysandra was right. A direct confrontation wasn't an option, but disabling their coordination would give them the upper hand. "Callan, can you target their flagship's command center?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "If we can break their communication, the rest of the fleet will fall into disarray." Callan didn't hesitate. "I'm on it." His fingers moved over the controls with practiced precision. The cruiser's main cannon powered up, and the systems hummed with potential. Eric turned to the rest of the crew. "Juno, I need you on the engines. We're going to need a fast getaway once we make our strike." Juno, who had been quiet for the most part, nodded and sprinted to the engine control station. "I've got it. Just give me the signal." Eric's heart pounded as the minutes ticked by. The pressure was suffocating. They had one shot to turn the tide, and if they failed, Galderach's forces would have them surrounded and outnumbered. He kept his eyes on the screens, watching for any signs of the enemy counteracting their control. Suddenly, a warning blared from the ship's communications. "Captain," Callan shouted, his voice tense. "The enemy flagship is locking onto us. They've started their countermeasure systems." Eric's eyes narrowed. "Not for long. Lysandra, can you disable their targeting systems?" Lysandra nodded, her silver eyes flickering with power. She stretched out her hand toward the central control panel, and Eric could feel the ship's systems vibrate in response. The air grew thick with energy as Lysandra focused. The lights in the control room flickered, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The hum of the ship's systems intensified as the targeting locks on the Tempest began to flicker and vanish. Callan let out a relieved breath. "She did it. We've got a window." Eric didn't waste a second. Fire. The main cannon of the cruiser blasted toward the enemy flagship, the explosion lighting up the dark expanse of space. The blast hit dead center, tearing through the flagship's shields and damaging its core systems. For a brief moment, the entire fleet seemed to hesitate. The chaos of their communication breakdown spread like wildfire as ships stopped in their tracks, unable to coordinate their next move. "We've got them on the ropes," Kalen called out, a grin spreading across his face. "The rest of their fleet is scrambling." But the victory was short-lived. Eric could feel the pressure building again. Galderach's forces wouldn't let this slip easily. "Kellen, Juno, prepare for a full retreat. Lysandra, we need to get to the Tempest now." Lysandra's eyes flickered with a hint of hesitation before she nodded, her expression hardening. "We can't stay here long. They'll figure out what happened." Juno's voice came through the comms. "Engines are ready for immediate launch, Captain. Just say the word." "Now," Eric ordered. In one swift motion, the crew moved to their positions. Kalen and Lysandra sprinted for the shuttle bay, the ship's corridors now echoing with the sound of their footsteps. Eric stayed behind for one last check, making sure everything was in place. He knew this was their only chance to escape, and the stakes had never been higher. As Eric made his way toward the shuttle bay, the ship trembled again from enemy fire. They weren't going to make it much longer before Galderach's forces regrouped. The pressure was mounting, and with each passing second, their window of escape was closing. Eric's heart raced as he pushed himself faster, not daring to look back. When he finally reached the shuttle bay, Lysandra, Kalen, and Juno were already inside the shuttle, ready for takeoff. Eric rushed in and took his place at the controls. Without a moment's hesitation, he initiated the launch sequence. The shuttle's engines roared to life, propelling them away from the damaged cruiser. Behind them, the enemy fleet was starting to regroup. The shuttle jerked and spun as Eric pushed the controls, trying to dodge the incoming fire from the enemy fleet. The remnants of Galderach's forces were closing in, their ships firing relentlessly at the Tempest's shuttle. Eric's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct told him to keep moving, to stay ahead of the oncoming barrage. But the enemy was everywhere, their fire constantly catching the shuttle's shields. "Juno, how long until we reach the Tempest?" Eric asked, his voice steady, though he could feel the sweat trickling down his neck. They needed to get back to their ship before Galderach's forces surrounded them completely. If they could just make it there, they might stand a chance of escaping. Juno's voice came through the comms, sharp and focused. "We're close, Captain. Just a few more seconds." The shuttle shook violently as another hit caused the shields to flicker. Eric gritted his teeth, swerving the shuttle to the side to avoid another round of fire. "Kellen, are we going to make it?" he asked, his eyes flicking to the rearview screen. "We can't outrun them much longer," Kellen replied, his voice tight. "We've got to get that ship ready to launch before we're sitting ducks." Eric glanced at the glowing readouts on the shuttle's dashboard. The shields were weakening, the energy rapidly depleting from each blast. They had to make it to the Tempest before the shields failed entirely, or they wouldn't survive long enough to escape. "Prepare for emergency landing," Eric ordered. "We're going straight for the hangar." The shuttle's engines roared as Eric pushed the throttle forward, aiming for the hangar bay of the Tempest. He knew they had no time to waste. If the enemy realized they were going for the hangar, they would try to block the entrance, and then they'd be trapped. The ship shook again, this time harder than before. The shuttle was hit, but Eric's hands never faltered as he guided the craft toward the hangar bay. The sound of the shuttle's alarm filled the cockpit, signaling the imminent failure of the shields. But just as he thought they might be doomed, the Tempest's massive hangar doors loomed ahead, and he could see the welcoming glow of their home ship. "Hold on," Eric shouted, as he maneuvered the shuttle to enter the hangar. With one last, gut-wrenching crash, the shuttle slammed into the landing pad inside the Tempest. The force of the impact caused Eric to grip the controls even tighter, but they had made it. The hangar was bustling with activity as the crew of the Tempest scrambled to prepare for the next phase of their escape. Eric's mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation. They had made it back, but they were still not out of danger. Galderuk's fleet was coming. Their forces were closing in. "We need to get the ship in the air now," Eric barked as he rushed toward the bridge. "We're ready for launch, Captain," Kalen called out, already at his station. Lysandra stepped forward, her silver eyes glinting with determination. "We can't keep running forever. It's time to take the fight to Galderuk." Eric looked at her, his gaze hardening. He knew what she meant. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. This was about ending Galderuk's reign of terror once and for all. "All hands, prepare for battle." Eric shouted over the comms, the words carrying across the ship. "It's time to show Galderuk that the Tempest doesn't bow to anyone." The crew sprang into action, their resolve hardening with each passing second. Eric took his seat at the helm, his eyes scanning the dark void of space as the Tempest powered up. The engines hummed with life, and Eric could feel the vibration through his seat. They were ready. As the massive ship began to lift off the ground, Eric's pulse quickened. They were no longer running. They weren't just trying to escape. They were about to turn the tide of the war. Galderuk's forces were still in pursuit, but this time, they would be the ones on the offensive. Lysandra stood beside Eric, her eyes focused on the enemy fleet that loomed just beyond the ship. "We'll need to strike fast," she said quietly. "If we take out their command ship, the rest will crumble." Eric's jaw tightened. "Then that's what we do." With a surge of power, the Tempest broke free from the hangar and rocketed into space. The enemy fleet was waiting, but they wouldn't be ready for the fight that was coming. Eric could feel it in his bones. The time had come to end this war. With a single, decisive blow, the Tempest would show Galderuk and his forces that humanity was not something they could simply gamble with or destroy. As they sped toward the enemy flagship, Eric felt a surge of confidence. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a fight for everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed. And with every ounce of his being, Eric knew they would win.